Welcome to the debate. What if, um, what if every wrong turn you've ever taken in your life was actually a required step to build the exact person you are today?
Yeah, it's a wild thought.
Right? Like when you watch a master artisan work, maybe a woodworker carving a complex dovetail joint or a jazz musician running through a really fast scale, there is a temptation to look at the sheer repetition of their movements and see a kind of confinement. It looks like a closed loop.
Oh, absolutely. It looks entirely mechanistic. You see the muscle memory taking over, and you inevitably wonder, where the actual freedom went, or if they've just programmed themselves into being a very elegant machine.
Exactly. But if you talk to that artisan, they will tell you the exact opposite. They will say the repetition is the only thing that created their freedom. The structure is what allows them to improvise when the moment demands it. So today, we are exploring that exact tension, but we are scaling it up to the level of an entire human life.
Right. We're looking at the doctrine of nosophia. This is the philosophical core of the Codex Historia, and it outlines a highly comprehensive, really rigorous framework for purposeful living. It draws a stark line between a reactive life, what the text calls wandering, and a deliberate life, which it calls weaving.
Mm-hmm.
In weaving, your encounters with the world are given meaning by a preset direction.
It's an undeniably fascinating framework, but it is also a deeply polarizing one if you pull back the curtain and really look at the practical implications of living that way. Which brings us to our central question today. Does the structured, recursive framework of this doctrine, where repeated intentional acts construct the self over time, does it offer a true pathway to wisdom and autonomy? Or does its highly codified mathematical nature risk trapping the individual in a deterministic loop that prematurely smooths over the chaotic, irreducible complexities of lived experience?
That is the question.
I will be arguing that the doctrine's precise architecture provides the absolute necessary scaffolding for genuine agency and character development.
And I will be arguing that this hyper-structured approach to becoming risks creating a closed, self-justifying system. It instrumentalizes human experience and severely limits our capacity to engage with the world's untidy, beautiful multiplicity.
Let's put our foundational positions on the table then. When I look at the doctrine of Nosophia, I see a brilliant, functional solution to the fundamental problem of how human beings actually cultivate character.
Okay.
The text introduces this concept of telesis, which it defines as a stack of nested aims, where each action serves the one above it. This is the mechanism that elevates mere habit into actual discipline. But the true elegance of the doctrine lies in a concept called chronomnesis.
Right, the weaver and the loom.
Yes, the Codex translates this loosely as the weaver is woven by the weaving. If we can embrace the fact that our repeated choices constantly edit the self that we'll choose next, we gain true sovereignty. We stop being passengers in our own minds.
But at what cost?
Well, the doctrine doesn't claim to shield us from loss or accident. Instead, it converts those accidents into usable material. It uses the analogy of a traveler in an unfamiliar city. If you are just wandering, a dead end is a waste of time. But if you have a specific destination, a wrong turn isn't wasted at all.
It sharpens the map.
Exactly. It just sharpens your map of the streets. The destination changes what the wrong turn is worth. That, to me, is the ultimate empowerment.
It certainly sounds empowering when you frame it as sharpening a map, but the systemic rigidity of this doctrine is deeply perilous. Let's look at the text's own analogy of a path worn across a field.
Okay.
The first person walks across the grass purely by chance. The second person, seeing the slightly bent grass, follows it. Eventually, the path stops being a choice and becomes something that chooses for the walker, pulling them into a deep groove.
That is the inherent danger of chrononesis. Furthermore, organizing all of your life through telesis, this so-called stack of aims, risks turning every single daily experience into a mere instrument for an overarching goal. I argue that true wisdom often lies entirely outside of utility.
Meaning?
It lives in the raw, unconverted experiences. Even the text contains a vital warning against its own system, noting that a grief hurried into instruction has been refused rather than understood. When we demand that every moment serve a grand purpose, we lose the actual world in front of us.
Well, let's dig into the actual plumbing of how telesis works. Because moving from wandering to weaving doesn't mean you stop experiencing the world. It means you fundamentally change how the world's input functions within you.
Sure.
The Codex uses this incredibly grounded analogy of chopping onions to explain the 4 depths of action. You chop the onions to build the stew. You build the stew for the Sunday meal. And you keep the Sunday meal so the household goes on eating together at one table.
Right. So 4 actions, but essentially one action read at 4 different depths of purpose?
Yes. And the key insight is what happens when you remove the top layer. Take away the overarching reason, the cohesion of the household, and the physical knife work doesn't get worse. The onions are still being cut just as cleanly.
But the direction is gone.
Exactly. What vanishes is the direction. The action degrades from something you are doing towards something into just something you are doing to pass the time. That purpose is the distinction between a metronome and a musician.
How so?
Both keep time perfectly, but the metronome keeps time toward nothing, while the musician keeps time toward a piece of music they can already hear in their head. Purpose is what gives life its melody.
I come at it from a different way. Demanding that every action serve a meticulously engineered stack of aims strips the intrinsic value from the act itself.
You think so?
I do. When you chop the onion, if your mind is already jumping ahead to the Sunday table and then jumping ahead again to the cohesion of your family unit, you are missing the onion.
Well,
You are completely missing the tactile, sensory reality of the present moment. If every moment must be subordinated to a higher goal, we lose the capacity to simply exist within the multiplicity of the world. We turn the present into a waiting room for the future. A person becomes so obsessed with the architecture of their intentions that they forget how to actually live in the house they are building.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective. The doctrine explicitly states that, quote, weaving does not mean that everything is thread.
Right.
It builds in a massive acknowledgement of its own limits. The framework isn't telling you to ignore the onion, and it is absolutely not telling you to instrumentalize profound trauma or sudden joy. It is providing you with a loom. Why discard the entire loom just because some things, like profound grief, shouldn't be woven?
Because once you build a machine that powerful, you are compelled to use it. And that brings us directly to the recursive nature of this whole system, chronomnesis, the tapestry that builds the loom upon which it is woven.
Right.
The Codex claims we are mostly the residue of our repeated acts. If that's true, then this hyper-purposeful life forces a person into what the text calls cyclection.
Okay, let's pause and unpack cyclection for the listener because it's a dense term. We are talking about the 4 phases of behavioral recursion, correct?
Yes, sensing, learning, expressing, and transforming. The doctrine posits that every time you act, you cycle through these 4 phases, and then you begin sensing again on newly changed ground.
Exactly.
You edit the self that will choose next. But if your actions continually edit the self that chooses next, and all your actions are strictly governed by your preset telesis, you are sealing the system shut. You are isolating yourself from the anomalous vital experiences that don't fit your grand design.
So you think it creates a blind spot?
Worse than a blind spot. You're deepening that path in the grass until the walls are so high you can't see the rest of the field. You've engineered your own psychological trap.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you are assuming recursion inevitably leads to rigidity.
Doesn't it?
No. The Codex offers a beautiful mathematical emblem to counter this exact fear, the cardioid.
Ah, the pins and the string.
And a ring of pins evenly spaced around a circle. You tie a string or draw a line joining each pin to the one at twice its number. Every single line you draw across that circle is perfectly straight. It's a flat, rigid, predictable rule.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, where those straight lines cross and crowd together, they leave a curved edge. They form a heart.
The complexity is what the simple rule looks like once it is let run.
Exactly the point the text is making. The complexity isn't poured in from the outside. Recursion doesn't just dig a trench. It generates incredible, organic complexity from simple foundations.
But what about the ego loop?
To prevent the ego loop you are warning about, the doctrine doesn't leave the recursion unchecked. It introduces the 6 virtues: humility, charity, gratitude, temperance, patience, and empathy.
Right, the virtues.
These are not moral ornaments to make the weaver feel good. They are structural safeguards. Humility is defined as the mechanism that holds the recursion open to correction. Empathy supplies the internal states of other people to prevent isolation. The system regulates itself.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that adding virtues as a systemic correction just piles more rules onto a closed system?
How is it just more rules?
You are trying to engineer an escape from engineering. The Codex says, without humility, the ego inflates until it can't see past itself. So it mathematically prescribes humility as a counterweight.
Right.
But a prescribed humility, enacted simply as part of a telesis stack to perfect one's own character, isn't true humility. It is just a more sophisticated form of control. It doesn't genuinely open the self to the unpredictable interference patterns of reality that the broader texts of the Codex Historia champion. You are still trying to process the wildness of existence through a predetermined algorithm.
Well, let's look at how that processing actually happens in the text, though. Because if purpose directs our actions, we have to examine how this recursively built character actually processes the messy reality of the world. We need to move from the internal architecture to the field of attention.
Oh boy, here we go.
The doctrine outlines 108 states of attention,
The torus.
which is where I think this entire philosophy borders on the absurd. Wait, let me lay out the geometry first, because it's brilliant. It maps attention using 6 senses, 3 times, memory, present, anticipation, 3 valences, and 2 currents. You multiply those out and you get 108 distinct states.
Right.
But it maps these out not as a spreadsheet, but as a topological surface, a torus, which is essentially the shape of a donut.
Mm-hmm.
If you're listening to this and thinking, that sounds like mathematical word salad, think about how it actually feels to process a painful memory. Say you lose a job or go through a breakup. You return to that memory constantly. The sense and the time are identical.
Yeah.
But because you have moved along the second axis of valence, maybe moving from broad despair to a quiet acceptance, you arrive at that exact same memory in a changed condition.
Meaning you return to the same place, but you are different.
Precisely. On a flat sheet of paper, you'd hit an edge and stop, or you'd just circle the same drain endlessly. On the torus, there is no edge. There is only return with difference. You wrap in 2 directions at once.
Okay.
You don't just go in circles, you travel in a spiral. It is a highly sophisticated, deeply functional model of emotional and psychological growth. It provides the topological proof that we are, in fact, always moving forward, even when we feel stuck.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
All right.
Mapping human consciousness onto a neat topological torus is overly mechanistic. Human attention is not a grid of 108 precise coordinates. By trying to categorize consciousness this cleanly, the doctrine is completely ignoring what the rest of the text calls holophonic truth.
For clarity, holophonic truth is the idea that meaning emerges holistically, like a hologram, where every piece contains the whole, but expressed through sound.
Yes, it means meaning emerges from chaotic resonance and dissonance. You don't get a symphony by plotting coordinates on a torus. You get it by listening to the unquantifiable space between the notes.
But
The torus is a comforting illusion. It gives the practitioner the feeling of control, the illusion that their trauma is just a point on a geometric surface that they are successfully spiraling away from. But raw grief doesn't care about your topology. It doesn't neatly shift its valence so you can feel like you're spiraling upward.
the torus is not a cage. It is a map that actively prevents despair. When someone is stuck in a cycle of profound grief, it feels exactly like a closed loop.
Sure,
The torus provides the intellectual framework to understand why we feel stuck and the proof that the loop is actually a spiral. The doctrine isn't saying the torus removes the pain. It's saying the torus allows you to integrate it. It is the syntax of making meaning out of suffering. Do you mean?
If my overarching goal is to spiral upward on this torus, then my grief is no longer just grief. It is a vehicle for my personal cyclection. It becomes a tool for my own becoming. And this instrumentalization becomes even more deeply problematic
when we scale it up from the individual to the community. How does a person engaged in this intense self-creation deal with anyone else? Let's talk about symphoria.
I am incredibly glad you brought up symphoria because it perfectly counters the fear that this philosophy creates isolated, robotic individuals. Symphoria is defined as purpose held in common. It is when separate melodies lock into harmony.
Okay.
And the doctrine is incredibly specific here. It explicitly rejects coercion. It states that shared direction must be conducted rather than commanded. Think of a symphony conductor. They don't play the instruments, they provide the shared time.
Right. The text draws heavily on the ruler from all the king's men, who is remembered for what he entrusted, not what he compelled.
Exactly. For symphoria to exist, the text outlines 3 mandatory conditions. Participants must have autonomy, they must feel competent, and the effort must connect them to others. That is the definition of a liberating communal philosophy.
If it works.
It doesn't create rigid, lonely weavers. It creates an orchestra. The participants keep time because they hear the same music, not because someone is cracking a whip behind them.
It is a beautiful ideal on paper, but I caution that symphoria is highly precarious and perhaps inherently contradictory when applied to a society of intense weavers. Think about the mechanics of this.
Go ahead.
If I am deeply entrenched in my own recursive chronomnesis, if my telesis stack is perfectly tuned to my own self-creation, and I am successfully spiraling on my torus, how do I align my direction with yours without one of us compromising our autonomy?
By finding the resonance between the 2 aims. That's what the conducting is.
But what if our purposes fundamentally do not resonate? What if they interfere destructively? My fear is that symphoria subtly masks a new form of hierarchy.
In what way?
Well, it sounds like a cooperative orchestra, but in practice, the person whose telesis is the most rigidly defined, the one whose path is the deepest groove in the grass, inevitably dictates the pattern for everyone else. The most stubborn weaver becomes the conductor, and the rest of us just become the threads.
The text praises the sovereign who delegates. But what happens when the delegated tasks simply do not fit the subject's own recursive paths?
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. Symphoria isn't about everyone having the exact same nested aims, and it certainly isn't about forcing submission. Right.
In the glossary of the Codex, there is a term, axithal, which describes a system held in creative tension. It thrives not despite its internal contradictions, but because of them. Symphoria doesn't erase difference, it harmonizes it. The master weaver isn't trying to make everyone weave the exact same tapestry. They are trying to ensure the looms don't destroy each other. It is about moving from a reactive, wandering society to a deliberate one.
But I will push back one last time and say a wandering society isn't necessarily a lost society.
You think wandering is better?
Sometimes wandering's the only way you discover the territory. If you are always staring at your map, constantly checking your coordinates on the torus, you never actually see the landscape.
The doctrine of New Sophia is a masterpiece of intellectual architecture. I will concede that point fully, but it is fundamentally an architecture of control. It wants to tame the irreducible, wild multiplicity of the world by filtering it through a predetermined stack of aims. Well, let's pull back and summarize where we've landed today, because I think the friction between our views perfectly mirrors the tension the Codex itself tries to hold.
Fair enough.
From my perspective, the doctrine of New Sophia remains a profound, highly functional grammar for living. It takes the terrifying chaos of existence and offers a way to navigate it with dignity. By utilizing telesis to structure our purpose and fully understanding chronomnesis, the reality that our repeated actions build the self, we can intentionally construct a meaningful life.
Right.
And by checking that recursion against the 6 virtues, we prevent the rigidity you fear. We convert random, painful wandering into a beautiful, complex cardioid of character. It doesn't deny the chaos. It gives us the practical tools to weave it into a life of genuine autonomy.
And I maintain that while the framework is mathematically and intellectually elegant, the human experience is too wild, too inherently messy to be fully mapped on a torus or woven on a single loom. The insistence on converting every experience into utility risks alienating us from the sheer, unweavable immediacy of life. We must leave room for the moments that defy cyclection entirely, the profound griefs that contain no lesson, the chaotic joys that serve no higher aim. Wisdom isn't always a direction. Sometimes wisdom is just the capacity to stand in the clearing without a map, without a purpose, and simply be.
And yet, even after all this debate, we both find ourselves anchored by the text's own internal warning, the phrase that seems to bridge both our perspectives. Weaving does not mean that everything is thread.
Yes. That single line is the doctrine's saving grace. Its ultimate insight is acknowledging its own limitations. Any system that refuses to recognize what it cannot process will eventually consume itself.
It is a vital reminder that there is far more to explore in the Codex Historia, especially regarding how we, as deeply fallible humans, balance the discipline of our intentions with the wild, unpredictable nature of our existence.
The conversation around this text is certainly far from over.
It never really is. We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the arguments and decide whether you prefer the security of the map or the promise of the uncharted streets. But the next time you find yourself taking a wrong turn in an unfamiliar city, ask yourself, is this an interruption of your journey or the exact moment the map finally sharpens into view?